Welcome to the Deep Dive with Collin Skipper, a ministry of Southside Christian Church. On the Deep Dive, we take time to explore biblical and theological issues that come up in Southside's preaching when there simply isn't time to look at them on a Sunday morning. We hope that this will be a resource to you as you study God's Word either on your own or with others. Now, let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is Collin, and today's Deep Dive is going to be a little bit different, actually quite a bit different from what we normally do on the podcast. This week I wanted to offer you just a reading from one of my from a chapter from one of my favorite authors' books. The Everlasting Man is the name of the book, and the author is G.K. Chesterton. This was a book. It's a book that's pretty old. It was released about 100 years ago in 1925, and it's a book of apologetics, which, if you don't know, is a discipline in which you make a rational defense of Christianity and the teachings of the Bible. And so G.K. Chesterton, the author, is really talking about Jesus, and he's talking about the history of the world through a Christian lens. And there's this chapter that is in the second part of the book that's called The God in the Cave. And this chapter is about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. And it is one of the most beautiful sections of literature that I've ever read. In fact, I have a little tradition where this is going to make you sound like such a nerd, but who cares? You already know that about me if you go to Southside. There's a chapter in the book, I have this tradition where I always, every Christmas season, every Advent, I come back and read this chapter at some point during the season, because it is just, honestly, to me, it's breathtakingly beautiful. It is an absolutely amazing account of the birth of Jesus Christ, and the reason that I want to share it with you, two things. First, I want to read it to you because it has a real connection to what we preached on, what I preached on this week in church. The beauty of the incarnation, the powerful story of God Almighty coming into our world as one of us, and not just as one of us, but going even lower than humanity, being born as a weak and helpless infant, a poor and needy family. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And what Chesterton does in this is he really draws out those themes in a way that is inspiring, sobering. It's a way that really challenges and encourages us to wonder, to worship God. And so that's why I want to share it with you. And the other reason, the lesser reason, is that I just think that that it's a cool thing this time of year to have these little traditions, to have these little, we do have movies that we come back to this time of year. We have things that we do together, but there's something about having something that we read, something that we appreciate, some form of art or literature that we take in around this time of year that really can do that. It can inspire worship and wonder. And so I wanted to share my tradition with you. And so I'm going to read you a good portion of the chapter. There's a lot that I'm going to skip over that's kind of in the middle of the chapter. If you are interested in reading the whole thing, you can find it very easily if you just Google G.K. Chesterton, The God in the Cave. This is a very old book, so you're going to find free copies of that very easily if you do that. And if that's something that interests you, I encourage you to read the whole thing. I'm going to read just portions of it because, again, this is an old book from 1925. Comes from a very different world in some ways, and so some of the references don't make a lot of sense. And I'll also tell you this: if you go and you read this chapter, I am not recommending Chesterton as like a good and careful theologian, because he's really not. That's not really what he's trying to do, though. That's not his training. He's writing literature, and so I recommend it in the sense that I believe it can inspire wonder and worship of God, just an awe of God at Christmas time. I am not recommending that you read it in order to build a theology out of it. So, important pastoral note there. And so I invite you, if you're listening to this, and if I haven't already lost your attention, you said, nope, not for me, but if you're sticking with it, if you want to listen to this, I invite you, no matter what you're doing right now, whether you're sitting down in a living room listening to this, whether you're driving in your car, whether you're on the treadmill or you're doing dishes or whatever it is, I invite you to try to really take in these words. Let them wash over you. If you don't understand every word or you don't catch every reference that he's making, that's okay. But really open your heart and open your mind to God using this description of the birth of his son to help drive you down deeper to the true meaning of this whole season, and to inspire you to a deeper and more awe-struck worship of God today. So without further ado, I'll start in on the reading, The God in the Cave, from The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. This sketch of the human story began in a cave. The cave which popular science associates with the caveman, and in which practical discovery has really found archaic drawings of animals. The second half of human history, which was like a new creation of the world, also begins in a cave. There is even a shadow of such a fancy in the fact that animals were again present, for it was a cave used as a stable by the mountaineers of the uplands around Bethlehem, who still drive their cattle into such holes and caverns at night. It was here that a homeless couple had crept underground with the cattle when the doors of the crowded caravanserai had been shut in their faces. And it was here, beneath the very feet of the passers-by, in a cellar under the very floor of the world, that Jesus Christ was born. But in that second creation, there was indeed something symbolical in the roots of the primeval rock, or the horns of the prehistoric herd. God also was a caveman, and had also traced strange shapes of creatures curiously colored upon the wall of the world, but the pictures that he had made had come to life. A mass of legend and literature, which increases and will never end, has repeated and rung the changes on that single paradox, that the hands that had made the sun and the stars were too small to reach the huge heads of the cattle. Upon this paradox, we might almost say upon this jest, all the literature of our faith is founded. It is at least a jest in this, that it is something which the scientific critic cannot see. He laboriously explains the difficulty which we have always defiantly and almost derisively exaggerated, and mildly condemns as improbable something that we have almost madly exalted as incredible, as something that would be much too good to be true, except that it is true. When that contrast between the cosmic creation and the little local infancy has been repeated, reiterated, underlined, emphasized, exulted in, sung, shouted, roared, not to say howled, in 100,000 hymns, carols, rhymes, rituals, pictures, poems, and popular sermons, it may be suggested that we hardly need a higher critic to draw our attention to something a little odd about it, especially one of the sort that seems to take a long time to see a joke, even his own joke. But about this contrast and combination of ideas, one thing may be said here, because it is relevant to the whole thesis of this book. The sort of modern critic of whom I speak is generally much impressed with the importance of education in life and the importance of psychology in education. That sort of man is never tired of telling us that first impressions fix character by the law of causation, and he will become quite nervous if a child's visual sense is poisoned by the wrong colors on a gollywog, or his nervous system prematurely shaken by a cacophonous rattle. Yet he will think us very narrow-minded if we say that this is exactly why there really is a difference between being brought up as a Christian and being brought up as a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist. The difference is that every Catholic child has learned from pictures, and even every Protestant child from stories, this incredible combination of contrasted ideas as one of the very first impressions on his mind. It is not merely a theological difference. It is a psychological difference which can outlast any theologies. It really is, as that sort of scientist loves to say about anything, incurable. Any agnostic or atheist whose childhood has known a real Christmas has ever afterwards, whether he likes it or not, an association in his mind between two ideas that most of mankind must regard as remote from each other. The idea of a baby and the idea of unknown strength that sustains the stars. His instincts and imagination can still connect them when his reason can no longer see the need of the connection. For him, there will always be some savor of religion about the mere picture of a mother and a baby, some hint of mercy and softening about the mere mention of the dreadful name of God. But the two ideas are not naturally or necessarily combined. They would not be necessarily combined for an ancient Greek or Chinese man, even for Aristotle or Confucius. It is no more inevitable to connect God with an infant than to connect gravitation with a kitten. It has been created in our minds by Christmas because we are Christians, because we are psychological Christians even when we are not theological ones. In other words, this combination of ideas has emphatically, in the much disputed phrase, altered human nature. There is really a difference between the man who knows it and the man who does not. It may not be a difference of moral worth, for the Muslim or the Jew might be worthier according to his lights, but it is a plain fact about the crossing of two particular lights, the conjunction of two stars in our particular horoscope. Omnipotence and impotence, or divinity and infancy, do definitely make a sort of epigram which a million repetitions cannot turn into a platitude. It is not unreasonable to call it unique. Bethlehem is emphatically a place where extremes meet. Here begins, it is needless to say, another mighty influence for the humanization of Christendom. If the world wanted what is called a non-controversial aspect of Christianity, it would probably select Christmas. Yet it is obviously bound up with what is supposed to be a controversial aspect, the respect paid to the Blessed Virgin. When I was a boy, a more Puritan generation objected to a statue upon my parish church representing the Virgin and Child. After much controversy, they compromised by taking away the child. One would think that this was even more corrupted with Mariolatry, unless the mother was counted less dangerous when deprived of a sort of weapon. But the practical difficulty is also a parable. You cannot chip away the statue of a mother from all round that of a newborn child. You cannot suspend the newborn child in midair. Indeed, you cannot really have a statue of a newborn child at all. Similarly, you cannot suspend the idea of a newborn child in the void or think of him without thinking of his mother. You cannot visit the child without visiting the mother. You cannot in common human life approach the child except through the mother. If we are to think of Christ in this aspect at all, the other idea follows as it is followed in history. We must either leave Christ out of Christmas, or Christmas out of Christ, or we must admit, if only as we admitted in an old picture, that these holy heads are too near together for the halos not to mingle and cross. It might be suggested in a somewhat violent image that nothing has happened in that fold or crack in the great gray hills, except that the whole universe had been turned upside down. I mean that all the eyes of wonder and worship which had been turned outwards to the largest thing were now turned inward to the smallest. The very image will suggest all that multitudinous marvel of converging eyes that makes so much of the colored Catholic imagery like a peacock's tail. But it is true in a sense that God, who had been only a circumference, was seen as a center, and a center is infinitely small. It is true that the spiritual spiral henceforward works inwards instead of outwards, and in that sense is centripetal and not centrifugal. The faith becomes, in more ways than one, a religion of little things. But its traditions in art and literature and popular fable have quite sufficiently attested, as has been said, this particular paradox of the divine being in the cradle. Perhaps they have not so clearly emphasized the significance of the divine being in the cave. Curiously enough, indeed, tradition has not very clearly emphasized the cave. It is a familiar fact that the Bethlehem scene has been represented in every possible setting of time and country, of landscape and architecture, and it is a wholly happy and admirable fact that men have conceived it as quite different according to their different individual traditions and tastes. But while all have realized that it was a stable, not so many have realized that it was a cave. Some critics have even been so silly as to suppose that there was some contradiction between the stable and the cave, in which case they cannot know much about caves or stables in Palestine. As they see differences that are not there, it's needless to add that they do not see differences that are there. When a well-known critic says, for instance, that Christ being born in a rocky cavern is like Mithras having sprung alive out of a rock, it sounds like a parody upon comparative religion. There is such a thing as the point of a story, even if it is like a story in the sense of a lie. And the notion of a hero appearing like Pallas from the brain of Zeus, mature and without a mother, is obviously the very opposite of the idea of a god being born like an ordinary baby and entirely dependent on a mother. Whichever ideal we might prefer, we should surely see that they are contrary ideals. It is as stupid to connect them because they both contain a substance called stone as to identify the punishment of the deluge with the baptism in the Jordan because they both contain a substance called water. Whether as a myth or a mystery, Christ was obviously conceived as born in a hole in the rocks primarily because it marked the position of one outcast and homeless. Nevertheless, it is true, as I have said, that the cave has not been so commonly or so clearly used as a symbol as the other realities that surround the first Christmas. And the reason for this also refers to the very nature of that new world. It was, in a sense, the difficulty of a new dimension. Christ was not born on the level of the world, but even lower than the world. The first act of the divine drama was enacted not only on no stage set above the sightseer, but on a dark and curtained stage sunken out of sight. And that is an idea very difficult to express in most modes of artistic expression. It is the idea of simultaneous happenings on different levels of life. Something like it might have been attempted in the more archaic and decorative medieval art. But the more the artists learned of realism and perspective, the less they could depict at once the angels in the heavens, and the shepherds on the hills, and the glory and the darkness that was under the hills. Perhaps it could have been best conveyed by the characteristic expedient of some of the medieval guilds, when they wheeled about the streets a theater with 3 stages, one above the other, with heaven above, the earth, and hell under the earth. But in the riddle of Bethlehem, it was heaven that was under the earth. There is in that alone the touch of a revolution, as of the world turned upside down. It would be vain to attempt to say anything adequate or anything new about the change which this conception of a deity born like an outcast or even an outlaw had upon the whole conception of law and its duties to the poor and outcast. It is profoundly true to say that after that moment there could be no slaves. There could be and were people bearing that legal title until the church was strong enough to weed them out. But there could be no more of the pagan repose and the mere advantage to the state of keeping it a servile state. Individuals became important, in a sense in which no instruments can be important. A man could not be a means to an end, at any rate to another man's end. All this popular and fraternal element in the story has been rightly attached by the tradition to the episode of the shepherds, the hinds who found themselves talking face to face with the princes of heaven. But there is another aspect of the popular element as represented by the shepherds, which has not perhaps been so fully developed, and which is more directly relevant here. Men of the people, like the shepherds, men of the popular tradition, had everywhere been the makers of the mythologies. It was they who had felt most directly, with least check or chill from philosophy or the corrupt cults of civilization, the need we already have considered. The images that were adventures of the imagination, the mythology that was a sort of search, the tempting and tantalizing hints of something half-human in nature, the dumb significance of seasons and special places. They had best understood that the soul of a landscape is a story, and the soul of a story is a personality. But rationalism had already begun to rot away these really irrational, though imaginative treasures of the peasant, even as systematic slavery had eaten the peasant out of house and home. Upon all such peasantries everywhere there was descending a dusk and twilight of disappointment, in the hour when these few men discovered what they sought. Everywhere else Arcadia was fading from the forest, Pan was dead, and the shepherds were scattered like sheep, and though no man knew it, the hour was near which was to end and to fulfill all things. And though no man heard it, there was one far-off cry, in an unknown tongue, upon the heaving wilderness of the mountains. The shepherds had found their shepherd. That is perhaps the mightiest of the mysteries of the cave. It is already apparent that though men are said to have looked for hell under the earth, In this case, it is rather heaven that is under the earth. And there follows in this strange story the idea of an upheaval of heaven. That is the paradox of the whole position, that henceforth the highest thing can only work from below. Royalty can only return to its own by a sort of rebellion. Indeed, the church from its beginnings, and perhaps especially in its beginnings, was not so much a principality as a revolution against the prince of the world. The sense that the world had been conquered by the great usurper and was in his possession has been much deplored or derided by those optimists who identify enlightenment with ease. But it was responsible for all that thrill of defiance and a beautiful danger that made the good news seem to be really both good and new. It was in truth against a huge unconscious usurpation that it raised a revolt, and originally so obscure a revolt. Olympus still occupied the sky like a motionless cloud, molded into many mighty forms. Philosophy still sat in the high places and even on the thrones of kings when Christ was born in the cave, and Christianity in the catacombs. In both cases, we may remark the same paradox of revolution, the sense of something despised and of something feared. The cave in one aspect is only a hole or corner into which the outcasts are swept, like rubbish. Yet in the other aspect it is a hiding place of something valuable, which the tyrants are seeking like treasure. In one sense they are there because the innkeeper would not even remember them, and in another because the king can never forget them. We have already noted that this paradox appeared also in the treatment of the early church. It was important while it was still insignificant, and certainly while it was still impotent. It was important solely because it was intolerable, and in that sense it is true to say that it was intolerable because it was intolerant. It was resented because in its own still and almost secret way it had declared war. It had risen out of the ground to wreck the heaven and earth of heathenism. It did not try to destroy all that creation of gold and marble, but it contemplated a world without it. It dared to look right through it as though the gold and marble had been glass. Those who charged the Christians with burning down Rome with firebrands were slanderers, but they were at least far nearer to the nature of Christianity than those among the moderns who tell us that the Christians were a sort of ethical society, being martyred in a languid fashion for telling men they had a duty to their neighbors, and only mildly disliked because they were meek and mild. Herod had his place, therefore, in the miracle play of Bethlehem, because he is the menace to the church militant, and shows it from the first as under persecution and fighting for its life. For those who think this is a discord, it is a discord that sounds simultaneously with the Christmas bells. For those who think the idea of the crusade is one that spoils the idea of the cross, we can only say for them the idea of the cross is spoiled. The idea of the cross is spoiled quite literally in the cradle. It is not here to the purpose to argue with them on the abstract ethics of fighting. The purpose in this place is to merely sum up the combination of ideas that make up the Christian idea, and to note that all of them are already crystallized in the first Christmas story. They are three distinct and commonly contrasted things which are nevertheless one thing, but this is the only thing which can make them one. The first is the human instinct for a heaven that shall be as literal and almost as local as a home. It is the idea pursued by all poets and pagans making myths, that a particular place must be the shrine of the god or the abode of the blessed, that fairyland is a land, or that the return of the ghost must be the resurrection of the body. I do not here reason about the refusal of rationalism to satisfy this need. I only say that if these rationalists refuse to satisfy it, the pagans will not be satisfied. This is present in the story of Bethlehem and Jerusalem as it is present in the story of Delos and Delphi, and as it is not present in the whole universe of Lucretius or the whole universe of Hubert Spencer. The second element is a philosophy larger than any other philosophies, larger than that of Lucretius and infinitely larger than that of Spencer. It looks at the world through 100 windows where the ancient Stoic or the modern agnostic only looks through one. It sees life with thousands of eyes belonging to thousands of different sorts of people, where the other is only the individual standpoint of a Stoic or an agnostic. It has something for all moods of man. It finds work for all kinds of men. It understands secrets of psychology. It is aware of depths of evil. It is able to distinguish between real and unreal marvels and miraculous exceptions. It trains itself in tact about hard cases, all with a multiplicity and subtlety and imagination about the varieties of life which is far beyond the bald or breezy platitudes of most ancient or modern moral philosophy. In a word, there is more in it. It finds more in existence to think about. It gets more out of life. Masses of this material about our many-sided life have been added since the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, but St. Thomas Aquinas alone would have found himself limited in the world of Confucius or of Comte. And the third point is this, that while it is local enough for poetry and larger than any other philosophy, it is also a challenge and a fight. While it is deliberately brought in to embrace every aspect of truth, it is still stiffly embattled against every mode of error. It gets every kind of man to fight for it. It gets every kind of weapon to fight with. It widens its knowledge of the things that are fought for and against with every art of curiosity or sympathy, but it never forgets that it is fighting. It proclaims peace on earth and never forgets why there was war in heaven. This is the Trinity of truth, symbolized here by the three types of the old Christmas story, the shepherds and the kings, and that other king who warred upon the children. It is simply not true to say that other religions and philosophies are in this respect its rivals. It is not true to say that any one of them combines these characters. It is not true to say that any one of them pretends to combine them. Buddhism may profess to be equally mystical. It does not even profess to be equally military. Islam may profess to be equally military. It does not even profess to be equally metaphysical and subtle. Confucianism may profess to satisfy the need of the philosophers for order and reason. It does not even profess to satisfy the need of the mystics for miracle and sacrament and the consecration of concrete things. There are many evidences of this presence of a spirit at once universal and unique. One will serve here, which is the symbol of the subject of this chapter, that no other story, no pagan legend or philosophical anecdote or historical event does in fact affect any of us with that peculiar and even poignant impression produced on us by the word Bethlehem. No other birth of a god or childhood of a sage seems to us to be Christmas or anything like Christmas. It is either too cold or too frivolous, or too formal and classical, or too simple and savage, or too occult and complicated. Not one of us, whatever his opinions, would ever go to such a scene with the sense that he was going home. He might admire it because it was poetical, or because it was philosophical, or any number of other things in separation, but not because it was itself. The truth is that there is a quite peculiar and individual character about the hold of this story on human nature. It is not in its psychological substance at all like a mere legend or the life of a great man. It does not exactly, in the ordinary sense, turn our minds to greatness, to those extensions and exaggerations of humanity which are turned into gods and heroes, even by the healthiest sort of hero worship. It does not exactly work outwards, adventurously, to the wonders to be found at the ends of the earth. It is rather something that surprises us from behind, from the hidden and personal part of our being, like that which can sometimes take us off our guard in the pathos of small objects or the blind pieties of the poor. It is rather as if a man had found an inner room in the very heart of his own house, which he had never suspected, and seen a light from within. It is as if he found something at the back of his own heart that betrayed him into good. It is not made of what the world would call strong materials, or rather it is made of materials whose strength is in that winged levity with which they brush us and pass. It is all that is in us, but a brief tenderness that is there made eternal, all that means no more than a momentary softening that is in some strange fashion become a strengthening and a repose. It is the broken speech and the lost word that are made positive and suspended unbroken, as the strange kings fade into a far country, and the mountains resound no more with the feet of the shepherds, and only the night and the cavern lie in fold upon fold over something more human than humanity. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that. If, in fact, there is anyone who has made it to the end here with me. Again, I just encourage you to make room for beauty and for awe and wonder, especially this time of year, but in our faith in general. Take time to enjoy mystery and the beauty of the gospel and the story of Christianity, and build into your life traditions that can evoke that kind of wonder and awe in you. That kind of thing can be a very powerful engine in your spiritual life to drive you to God, to inspire you to prayer, to awaken a hunger for His Word and His people in you, and to call you to live out of the story that He's telling in your life and in our world. And so I hope that this was a blessing to you, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the coming weeks and the coming year. And let me just say, Merry Christmas. God bless you.